He is called Ares, and before his name is spoken, the sound of iron already fills the air. Not the clean ring of a smith's hammer, but the harsh clash of shields colliding, the scream of metal biting into metal, the thunder of feet charging across broken ground. Where Ares walks, the earth seems to harden beneath him, as if the land itself braces for violence. He is not the war of careful plans or clever strategy. He is war unleashed, raw, impulsive, and burning with a hunger that never truly sleeps. Ares was born into the highest house of the gods, the son of Zeus and Hera, rulers of Olympus and symbols of divine authority. Yet from the beginning, he never fit comfortably within that shining order. Where Zeus ruled through thunder and command, and Hera through law and ritual, Ares embodied something older and more dangerous, the joy of conflict for its own sake. His presence was loud, restless, and difficult to contain, even among immortals. As a child of Olympus, Ares grew tall and strong with unnatural speed. His body seemed forged rather than born, hardened as if the essence of battle itself flowed through his veins. The gods watched him with wary eyes. Some saw in him a necessary force, a living embodiment of struggle that defined both gods and mortals. Others saw only chaos, a god who delighted too much in destruction and cared too little for what remained afterward. Even his parents, powerful as they were, found him troubling. They could not deny his strength, but they feared the way he used it. Ares did not linger in the halls of Olympus the way other gods did. He did not sit through councils or debates unless forced. His patience for words was thin. He preferred motion, marching, riding, testing his strength against anything that dared to resist. When the gods gathered to speak of balance and order, Ares often slipped away, drawn instead to the mortal world below, where conflicts were constant and cries of war rose like smoke toward the heavens. To the ancient Greeks, Ares was a god both honored and feared. He was invoked before battles, not always with love, but with necessity. Warriors prayed to him not because he was gentle or wise, but because he understood the terror and fury of the battlefield. He knew the pounding heart before a charge, the trembling hands gripping a spear, the moment when fear turns into reckless courage. In Ares, soldiers saw their own worst and strongest selves reflected back at them. He did not walk alone. Wherever Ares went, his entourage followed, an echo of his nature made flesh and spirit. Closest to him were his sons, Phobos and Deimos. Fear and terror, spirits born from his union with the goddess of love. They were not children in any mortal sense, but living forces that raced ahead of their father into every conflict. Phobos crept into the hearts of soldiers, tightening their chests and clouding their thoughts. Deimos shattered resolve entirely, sending armies into chaos before blades ever met. When these two rode beside Ares, even the bravest warriors felt their courage falter. Alongside them moved Enyo, the goddess of war's devastation, a figure often mistaken for Ares himself in her ferocity. Where Ares thrived in the clash, Enyo delighted in what came after: the burning cities, the cries of the defeated, the ruin left behind when victory had turned hollow. Together they formed a terrifying procession, a living storm of violence that swept across battlefields and left nothing unchanged in its wake. Ares' armor was said to shine like fire under the sun. His spear never dulled, his shield never cracked. Yet it was not his weapons that defined him most, but his voice. Ancient stories speak of Ares' war cry as something more than sound, a roar that rolled across plains and through valleys, stirring blood and panic alike. Mortals who heard it knew that battle had crossed a line, from skirmish to slaughter, from conflict to frenzy. Despite his power, Ares was not universally admired among the gods. In fact, many openly despised him. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic war, stood as his opposite in nearly every way. Where she planned and calculated, Ares rushed headlong into conflict. Where she valued victory with minimal loss, Ares cared little for cost. Their clashes were legendary, not just on the battlefield, but in the very philosophy of war itself. To Athena, war was a tool. To Ares, it was a purpose. This tension followed Ares everywhere, even into his relationships. No bond illustrates this better than his affair with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Their union seemed, on the surface, a contradiction. Love entwined with war, desire bound to destruction. Yet in myth, the two were inseparable. Aphrodite saw in Ares a raw intensity that no other god possessed. He, in turn, was drawn to her as fiercely as he was to battle, captivated by her power to inflame hearts as thoroughly as he inflamed battlefields. From their union came not only Phobos and Deimos, but also Harmonia, a living symbol of balance born from chaos and desire. In Harmonia, the Greeks saw a quiet truth. Even from the most violent union, harmony might emerge. Yet Ares himself rarely embodied that lesson. He loved Aphrodite passionately, but his love was as volatile as his temper, burning bright and often leaving scars behind. The myths do not hide Ares' failures. Unlike many gods, he is not always victorious. There are tales where he is wounded, humiliated, even captured. In one story, giants trap him in a bronze jar, silencing the god of war and allowing peace to briefly settle over the world. When he is freed, his rage is legendary. But the story leaves a lingering question. What happens when war itself is restrained? For a moment, the world breathes easier. These stories mattered deeply to the people who told them. Ares was not a comforting god. He was not a protector of cities or a guardian of justice. He was a reminder. Through him, the Greeks acknowledged a truth they could not escape. War is not always noble, and those who love it too much are often the most dangerous of all. Yet Ares endured. He remained a god worshipped in certain cities, especially those shaped by constant conflict. In Sparta, where discipline and combat defined society, Ares found a harsher kind of respect. There, he was not scorned for his brutality, but recognized as a force that forged strength through struggle. Even then, he was approached carefully, with rituals meant to bind and control his wild nature, rather than unleash it completely. When Ares stood on the battlefield, the sky itself seemed to darken. Dust rose with every step, and the air grew heavy with the scent of sweat and iron. Mortals who fought under his gaze felt both empowered and doomed, driven beyond their limits yet aware that survival was never guaranteed. Victory under Ares was loud and bloody. Defeat was absolute. And still, Ares charged forward, again and again, into every conflict that called his name. He did not ask who was right or wrong. He did not care which banners flew above the ranks. All that mattered was the clash, the moment when tension snapped and violence erupted. To Ares, that moment was sacred. This is where his story truly begins. Not in the calm of Olympus, nor in the quiet prayers whispered before dawn, but in the instant when peace breaks and the world chooses war. In the roar of battle, in the pounding of hearts, in the chaos where fear and courage become indistinguishable, the god of war finds his home. And as long as conflict exists among gods or mortals, Ares will never truly fade. He waits in every raised fist, every drawn blade, every decision to fight rather than yield, watching, smiling, ready to ride once more into the storm he loves above all else. When Ares returned to Olympus after a season of mortal fighting, he never came back the way other gods did. Apollo would arrive with a melody still clinging to his fingers. Artemis would step in like wind off the mountains, quiet and self-contained. Athena would enter with her mind already arranged into clean lines, as if every thought had been filed and labeled before she spoke. Ares came back like a storm that refused to end at the border. He arrived with dust in his hair, bronze glare in his eyes, and a pulse in the air that made lesser spirits flinch. Even when he stood perfectly still, he looked like he was about to lunge. The halls of Olympus were made for grandeur, for ceremony, for order. Ares was grandeur without restraint, ceremony without patience, order that could snap like a spear shaft in a strong hand. And the strangest thing was this: Ares did not always want war for politics. He did not always want it for conquest. Sometimes he wanted it simply because he could feel it coming, like a hunter smelling rain in the air, like a wolf hearing distant hooves. Conflict gathered in the world, and Ares felt it before mortals did. He felt it in the tremor of grudges, in the tightening of borders, in the way a king's pride stiffened when a rival dared to smile. To Ares, peace was not a triumph. It was a pause. It was the silence between clashes. That is why his entourage mattered so much. Because Ares did not travel as a solitary god, despite the way many myths paint him as an outsider among Olympians. On the battlefield, he was a commander of forces you could not always see. His companions were not just attendants. They were extensions of him, pieces of war made into walking shapes. Phobos and Deimos were always closest. Fear and terror, born of his bond with Aphrodite, were not childish spirits trailing behind their father. They were swift, sharp, and eager. They moved like shadows at the edges of vision, and yet their presence could be felt in the center of the chest, where breath catches. Phobos had a talent for making a brave soldier imagine the worst possible moment. An arrow through the throat, a friend falling beside him, a stumble at exactly the wrong time. Deimos had a talent for turning that imagination into certainty. Phobos whispered, and Deimos convinced. Together they could undo an army before the first shield wall even met. Eneo followed too. War's ruin given a name. She was the taste of ash after a city burned, the sound of doors splintering, the crackle of smoke as it curled around statues and shrines. Enyo did not bother with why. She did not bother with who deserved what. She cared for the aftermath. She was the memory that war carved into stone. And there were others, less spoken of but always near, spirits of clamor and confusion. The restless ones that feed on shouting crowds and panicked stampedes. Even the birds of battle seemed to know Ares' path, circling above him as if the air itself anticipated what would come. So when Ares came back to Olympus, that entourage did not vanish. They hovered, they listened, they learned the rhythms of the divine household, and sometimes, when the gods were foolish enough to believe themselves immune to mortal instincts, the presence of Ares' companions reminded them otherwise, because the gods fought too, not always with spears, often with words, with influence, with favor. And Ares, who cared little for debates, was still a god of Olympus. His bloodline was royal, his pride was sharp. If the other gods looked down on him, he would not shrink. He would glare back with the certainty of a blade. There was one who did not look down on him, at least not in the same way. Aphrodite. Their bond was a rumor that never fully became old news because it was too dangerous to be dismissed. Love and war, beauty and brutality. The union sounded like a contradiction, but in practice it made a kind of sense that mortals understood instinctively. Passion and violence are close neighbors. Desire can be reckless. Jealousy can ignite. A single look can begin a conflict that ends with cities fallen. Aphrodite did not fear Ares' nature. If anything, she recognized it as familiar, because love was not gentle all the time either. Aphrodite's power could soothe, yes, but it could also unmake. It could lure gods into foolish choices. It could make mortals betray their own families. It could drive a person to risk everything just to be seen by the one they wanted. Ares admired that. In her, he found a force as unstoppable in hearts as he was on battlefields. And Aphrodite, for her part, saw in Ares something she could not manufacture with perfume and soft laughter. Absolute intensity. Ares did not pretend. He did not scheme to impress. He wanted, and the wanting itself was like a flame. When they were together, it was not always tender. It was not always calm. Their relationship was a collision. Two great powers meeting, clashing, and refusing to step aside. Sometimes that collision produced beauty. Sometimes it produced disaster. And sometimes it produced children who were not just children. but symbols: fear, terror, harmony. That last one always stood out like a quiet note in the middle of thunder. Harmonia, the child of Ares and Aphrodite, was the reminder that balance can be born from extremes. It did not mean Ares became gentle. It did not mean Aphrodite became cautious. It meant that the world, strange and complicated, could produce a calm center even between chaos and desire. But Ares did not live at the center. He lived at the edge. And on that edge, one of the most famous stories about him begins, not with a battle, but with a trap. Because Ares' strength had one weakness: his pride. He was not stupid. The myths do not reduce him to a fool. He could read a battlefield. He could recognize danger. But when it came to his own appetites, his hunger for glory, his hunger for conquest, his hunger for Aphrodite, he sometimes rushed forward without thinking. And someone was watching. Helios, the sun, who saw everything the light touched, noticed more than most gods wanted to admit. Mortals might hide behind walls, behind shadows, behind lies. Helios watched from above, unblinking. He saw secret meetings. He saw stolen kisses. He saw the moments that people thought belonged only to them. So when Ares slipped into Aphrodite's chambers, thinking himself safe in the privacy of divine night, Helios saw, and Helios told Hephaestus. Now Hephaestus was not a war god. He was not built for charging into conflict. He carried his own burdens: craft, invention, endurance, the long patience of a creator who is often underestimated. He could not outmuscle Ares. He knew it. And Ares knew it too. That perhaps was part of the arrogance. But Hephaestus had a different kind of strength. The strength of making, the strength of precision, the strength of knowing that if you cannot overpower a storm, you can build something that forces it to stop. So Hephaestus forged a net. Not a fisherman's net, not a rope net that can be cut. A net of such fine metalwork that it looked like nothing at all until it tightened. Threads thinner than hair, stronger than chains. A trap so subtle it was almost beautiful. And when Ares and Aphrodite met again in their secret place, the net fell. It did not fall with a crash. It closed like a thought, like a blink. One moment Ares was there, confident and burning with triumph, and the next he was pinned. Immortal limbs caught in a mesh that did not break. For Ares, the humiliation was worse than any wound. War gods can endure pain. They can endure blood. They can endure defeat if it comes with honor. But to be caught, displayed, laughed at, this was a kind of defeat that tasted bitter in the mouth. Hephaestus did not keep it private. That was the point. He summoned the gods. And the gods came. They came to witness the scandal, to laugh, to whisper, to pretend they were shocked, while secretly relieved it wasn't their own secrets being dragged into the light. In that moment, Olympus did not feel like a home of divine dignity. It felt like a crowded hall of gossip and judgment. Ares, trapped, could not swing a spear at laughter. He could not drown it out with a war cry. He had to hear it. And Aphrodite endured it with a kind of icy, offended silence, as if her beauty should have been immune to shame. The male gods, as the old stories often point out, were not as outraged as Hephaestus wanted them to be. Some were amused, some were envious, some looked too long. That only deepened Ares' rage. Not rage at Aphrodite, not rage at Helios, rage at being made small, at being made a spectacle. Eventually, the net was released. The story shifts depending on who tells it. Some say a bargain was made, some say pressure was applied, some say the gods simply grew bored and moved on. But the outcome was the same. Ares escaped, and the moment he could move again, he was gone like lightning. Not Zeus's lightning. Ares was not clean fire. He was a strike of iron, a sudden rush, a god leaving behind the memory of humiliation like a dent in bronze. Aphrodite withdrew too, seeking comfort in places tied to her own origin. Cyprus, the sea air, the soft places where beauty could recover from being turned into a joke. She was love, yes, but she was also pride. Ares, however, did not go to soft places. He went where his name still meant power. He went down to the mortal world, where no net made by a smith could hold him for long, where battle could drown embarrassment in noise, where soldiers did not laugh at him. They feared him. That was the thing about Ares. When the gods mocked him, mortals bled for him. He arrived at the edge of a conflict like a hungry wolf arriving at a wounded herd. Cities were already tense, borders already restless, leaders already looking for excuses. And when Ares stepped into that simmering tension, it boiled over. Phobos ran ahead, brushing fingers across the throats of young men who had never seen war before. Deimos followed, pushing them from unease into panic. Enyo smiled at the thought of ruins to come. And Ares drank in the noise. Not literally, not like a cup of wine, but like breath, like oxygen. He moved through armies and camps with the ease of someone walking through their own home. He brushed shoulders with generals, whispered courage into their anger, nudged them toward recklessness. He watched the first line of soldiers march, and he felt the tremor of their fear like music. This is where the Greeks understood him best. Because Ares was not just the clash between enemies. Ares was also the war within a person. He was the impulse to strike back before thinking, the pride that refuses to apologize, the moment when an insult becomes a reason to fight, the surge in the blood that makes someone feel unstoppable, right before they do something they cannot undo. On the battlefield, Ares was not always fair. He did not reward the noble. He did not punish the cruel. He simply amplified whatever was already there. A brave soldier might become fearless. A cruel soldier might become monstrous. A frightened soldier might become dangerous. And in the chaos, Ares laughed. But here is the detail that makes him more than a simple villain in the myths. Ares was not invincible. He was powerful, yes, but not untouchable, not unstoppable. There were times he was checked, opposed, even wounded. Athena, in particular, often stood against him, not as a pacifist, but as another form of war. When Athena entered a conflict, it was like the temperature dropped. Soldiers held formation, plans sharpened. The chaos Ares loved began to meet structure, and structure is something chaos can break itself against. Ares hated that, not because Athena was stronger in raw force. He could match many gods in strength, but because she made war into something disciplined, and discipline is a kind of chain, and Ares had just escaped a net. So when Athena's presence entered the battlefield, Ares felt it like a provocation, a challenge, a reminder that not all war belonged to him. Their rivalry was more than personal. It was a contest over what war meant, over what mortals should admire, over whether violence was a glorious frenzy or a controlled instrument. Ares would never admit it aloud, but Athena's style of war often won favor, among gods and mortals alike. Cities praised strategy, poets praised clever victories, kings praised the kind of war that built empires rather than burned them. Ares received a different kind of praise, the praise of men who enjoyed the fight itself, the praise of those who could not live without conflict, the praise of those who believed that peace was weakness. And that praise, even if it was not always respectable, still fed him. Yet even with that, Ares carried the sting of Olympus's laughter within him, like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. He did not forget being trapped. He did not forget being displayed. He did not forget the eyes of the gods on him while he could do nothing. So he became sharper, more reckless, more eager to prove that he could never be held again. That eagerness drove him into a story that reveals another side of him, not as a triumphant god, but as a god who could be surprised by the consequences of his own impulses. Because war always promises control, and then proves it was never controlled at all. Ares stepped into a mortal conflict where two kingdoms had been trading insults for years. Their leaders were proud, their soldiers tired, their people hungry. It should have been a short, decisive battle. Ares wanted it that way. He wanted a clean clash, a sudden eruption, a quick victory that would let him claim glory and move on. But war, once unleashed, has a mind of its own. A skirmish turned into a chase turned into a massacre. Fires spread where no one meant them to. A frightened soldier struck down a civilian. A mother screamed. A son picked up a fallen spear and stabbed back. And suddenly the battlefield was not just soldiers. It was everyone. Ares watched the chaos widen, and for the first time in a long time, even he paused. Not because he felt pity the way a gentle god might, but because even Ares could recognize when war stopped being a contest and became a plague. This is what made him so feared in myth. He loved the clash, but he also represented what happens when the clash cannot be contained. When violence spreads beyond the line of armies and crawls into homes, into fields, into the future. Enyo loved that. Phobos and Deimos thrived in it. Ares stood in it like a god staring into a mirror, because the world below was doing what he always encouraged. And it was ugly. So he did what he always did when confronted with complexity. He leaned into it. He took the ugliness and made it louder. He became the roar that drowned hesitation. He became the push that turned fear into frenzy. He became the god who did not have to answer for consequences because, to him, consequences were simply more conflict. And yet, even as he did this, something else stirred above. Zeus watched. Not always closely. Zeus had a vast world to rule, endless disputes, endless divine intrigues. But Zeus watched enough to know when a conflict threatened the balance of the mortal world. Because if mortals destroyed themselves too thoroughly, who would build temples? Who would offer prayers? Who would keep the stories alive? The gods, for all their immortality, depended on mortal attention more than they liked to admit. So when war grew too consuming, when it threatened to swallow entire regions into ruin, Zeus sent a warning down like a dark cloud. Not a thunderbolt, not yet. A warning, and Ares felt it. He felt his father's authority pressing into the air, the same way mortals feel a storm approaching. Zeus did not need to speak. The message was clear. Enough. Ares clenched his jaw, because being told enough was exactly what he hated. It sounded too much like the net closing. It sounded too much like being restrained. So Ares did not stop, not immediately. Instead, he sought a way to obey without bowing, to satisfy Zeus without seeming to submit, to prove he was still a god of Olympus, still royal, still powerful. He turned his attention toward champions, toward the kind of mortal warriors who could carry his presence like a banner. Because if Ares could not claim the war itself entirely, he could still claim the hearts of the fiercest fighters within it. He began to choose favorites. This is where the myths often show him as fickle, supporting one side, then another, driven less by justice than by excitement. But there is another way to see it. Ares was attracted to intensity. He favored the soldier who fought with passion rather than calculation. He favored the one who roared and charged rather than waited and measured. He favored mortals who resembled him. And when he found one, a young warrior with reckless courage, Ares drew close. Not like a gentle mentor, like a fire leaning toward dry grass. He filled the warrior with confidence. He made the soldier's muscles feel lighter, the spear feel steadier, the fear feel distant. The warrior began to win, began to rise, began to believe he was unstoppable. That belief is one of Ares' greatest gifts, and one of his cruelties. Because as the warrior's victories stacked up, so did the pride. And pride leads to challenges, and challenges lead to greater battles. Soon the young champion was not satisfied with defeating enemies. He began to provoke them, to taunt, to push conflict further, because conflict had become the proof of his worth. Ares watched, pleased, until, inevitably, a wiser force entered. Not Zeus this time, not Athena. A mortal commander with patience, a commander who did not rush, a commander who let the champion charge, then trapped him, not with a net of metal, but with the net of strategy. A feigned retreat, a hidden line of spears, a sudden encirclement. The champion fell, and Ares, watching from the edge, felt a cold pulse of fury. Because the champion's defeat did not feel like a mortal loss. It felt personal. It felt like someone had insulted Ares by proving that raw courage could be outplayed. So Ares stepped forward himself. And when a god steps into a battlefield fully, the world notices. The sky seems heavier. The wind changes. Men feel their knees weaken without knowing why. Horses rear, birds scatter. Even seasoned warriors glance upward, suddenly aware that something beyond human scale has joined the fight. Ares took form in full armor, his presence roaring before his voice did. Phobos and Deimos rode at his sides. Enyo moved behind, smiling like someone who already knows how the story ends. Ares lifted his spear, and then a chill cut through the air. Not fear, not terror, something cleaner, something sharper. Athena. She arrived not with a roar, but with a clarity that snapped into the world like a blade unsheathed. Her eyes were steady. Her shield gleamed with purpose. She looked at Ares as if he were not an unstoppable storm, but an unruly force that could be directed, contained, outmatched. Ares' grip tightened. Because this was not just a battle of gods. It was the old argument again. Chaos versus discipline, fury versus reason. The myths often show Athena winning these contests, not because Ares is weak, but because uncontrolled war is self-defeating. It burns too hot, too fast. It collapses under its own weight. And Ares, deep down, knew that. That knowledge only made him angrier. So he charged, not with the careful, measured approach of a duelist, but with the full force of war itself. His spear cut the air, his shield slammed forward, his war cry shook dust from the ground. Athena did not flinch. She moved, precise, and met him with a force that felt like the world choosing order over frenzy. Their clash did not end the war. Wars do not end that way. But it shifted it. It reminded mortals that bravery without thought is not always glory, that courage can be led into traps, that war is not only a roar, it is also a plan. Ares pulled back, furious, humiliated again, not by laughter this time, but by the quiet certainty of being checked. Phobos and Deimos swirled around him, trying to feed his anger. Enyo whispered of ruin. Ares looked out over the battlefield, over the dead and the living, over the smoke and the scattered shields. And something in him hardened. Not softened, hardened. Because if he could not always win against Athena's kind of war, he could still remain what he had always been. The god who made war feel unavoidable. The god who turned conflicts into catastrophes. The god who ensured that even when strategy won, blood was still paid. Ares did not need to be loved by Olympus to endure. He only needed mortals to keep fighting. And mortals, as the gods knew, would never stop entirely. So Ares withdrew from that battlefield with a promise burning behind his eyes. A promise not spoken aloud. A promise felt. That the next time he came, he would come with something more than fury. He would come with a lesson, a demonstration, a reminder to gods and mortals alike that the heart of war cannot be argued into peace. It can only be faced and survived. Or not. After Troy, after humiliation and fury and the sharp reminder that even a god of war could be checked, Ares did not disappear. He endured. That, more than victory, was always his true talent. Time moved forward in the world of mortals, as it always does. Cities rebuilt, songs were rewritten, heroes died and were replaced by new names, new ambitions, new conflicts waiting to be born. The Olympians watched this endless cycle with varying degrees of interest, but Ares watched it the way a predator watches a herd. Not with hatred, not with mercy, but with attention. Because war does not end. It changes shape, and Ares changed with it. No longer did he rush into every battlefield as a roaring god in full armor. He had learned, slowly and painfully, that appearing too openly invited resistance, from Athena, from Zeus, from the balance the gods pretended to maintain. So Ares adapted, not toward peace, but toward subtlety. He became quieter, more patient, not calmer, never calmer, but more selective. Where Athena shaped heroes who planned and calculated, Ares gravitated toward those who burned from the inside. He watched children grow into warriors. He watched young men train with rage disguised as ambition. He watched women sharpen their strength in worlds that underestimated them. And when he saw that fire, the kind that does not flicker, the kind that demands release, Ares leaned close. One of the clearest places this fire burned was among the Amazons. The Amazons were not simply warriors in myth. They were a challenge, a contradiction to expectations. A society shaped by strength, discipline, and independence, often imagined at the edges of the known world where Greek norms lost their certainty. To many storytellers, they were unsettling. To Ares, they were familiar. Some traditions said he fathered Amazons. Others said he merely inspired them. Either way, the connection endured. In the Amazons, Ares saw a reflection of war unbound by convention. They did not fight to conquer empires or impress poets. They fought to survive, to defend, to assert their right to exist on their own terms. Their battles were not spectacles. They were necessities. Ares respected necessity. He did not soften them. He did not protect them from loss. He pushed them to endure it. In Amazonian myth, Ares was not a distant god. He was a presence, a brutal teacher who did not promise victory, only strength enough to face what came next. This relationship revealed something often missed about Ares. He did not care about domination. He cared about resistance. War, to Ares, was not just about crushing an enemy. It was about meeting force with force, about standing when standing hurt, about refusing to collapse, even when the cost was high. That is why he often favored the losing side. Not because he loved defeat, but because desperation burns hotter than confidence. Ares found beauty in the last stand, in the charge made with full knowledge that survival was uncertain. He admired the moment when a warrior chose to fight not because they expected to win, but because surrender felt worse. This is why his presence in myths so often coincides with tragedy. Ares did not save heroes. He tested them, and tests, by nature, are cruel. Over time, poets began to understand this. They stopped treating Ares as a simple villain and began to portray him as something more dangerous, a truth about the world given form. War is not always rational. It is not always just. It does not always reward the clever or the good. Sometimes it rewards only the furious. And sometimes it rewards no one at all. Even Ares was not immune to this truth. There came a moment, rare but telling, when Ares found himself caught not by another god, not by a crafted net, but by consequences. A mortal king, favored briefly by Ares for his ferocity, waged war after war without pause. He burned cities, enslaved survivors, and believed himself untouchable because victory followed him wherever he went. He prayed loudly to Ares before every battle, thanking the god for his strength. At first, Ares was amused. Then he grew bored. Because the king stopped fighting resistance, he began fighting weakness, and weakness does not challenge war, it degrades it. So Ares withdrew his favor, not with a warning, not with a sign. He simply left. The next battle came, and the king charged as always, confident that rage would carry him through. But rage without momentum collapses inward. His army broke. His enemies adapted. His cruelty returned to him sharpened. The king died screaming, calling Ares' name. Ares did not answer. This was another lesson the myths quietly carried. Ares does not guarantee success. He does not promise protection. To mistake his presence for loyalty is to misunderstand him completely. He is not a patron, he is a catalyst. This misunderstanding is what kept Ares isolated among the gods. Zeus tolerated him. Hera claimed him as a son but rarely defended him. Athena opposed him. Apollo dismissed him. Even Hermes, messenger and trickster, knew better than to rely on Ares' favor. Only Aphrodite truly understood him, and even that understanding was incomplete. Their bond continued, though it changed. Less reckless than before, more wary of exposure. They did not stop being drawn to one another. Love and war do not simply disentangle themselves because they have been embarrassed once. But Aphrodite saw something in Ares after Troy, after the wounds, after the lessons. She saw a god who was not broken, but scarred. And scars, she knew, shape desire as much as beauty does. In quieter myths, those less concerned with spectacle, Ares is shown lingering in places after battle, not celebrating, not weeping, simply present. Standing among the aftermath, while Enyo delights and Phobos fades and Deimos drifts away to the next conflict, Ares stands. This is the version of him most unsettling to imagine. The god of war not in motion, not roaring, just there, as if listening, as if taking measure, as if feeling the weight of what has been done, not with regret, but with recognition. Because war, once finished, leaves silence. And silence is not something Ares enjoys. It reminds him that he exists only when conflict exists, that without struggle, he has no purpose, no song, no prayer. Peace does not erase him, but it starves him. So he waits. And waiting, for a god of impulse, is its own kind of torment. That torment drives him to stir things again, not always violently at first. Sometimes with pride, sometimes with insult, sometimes with whispered rumors that turn neighbor against neighbor. Ares learned that war does not always begin with weapons. Sometimes it begins with words that refuse to heal. And this understanding made him more dangerous than ever. Not louder, not stronger, more precise. When civil wars erupted in myth, when families split, when cities turned inward, when loyalty became uncertain, Ares was always close. He did not need banners or battlefields. He needed only division. The Greeks feared this aspect of him deeply because it reflected their own anxieties. External enemies could be fought. Internal ones were harder to face. Ares was the god who showed what happens when conflict stops being about survival and starts being about identity. Who are we, if not opposed to them? Who are we, if not victorious? Who are we, if we choose not to fight? Those questions still echo through his myths, because they are not ancient questions at all. They are human ones. Even Zeus, watching from Olympus, understood that Ares could never be destroyed. He was too fundamental, too deeply woven into mortal behavior. You could wound him, shame him, contain him, but you could not erase him. And perhaps Zeus did not truly want to. Because order without the threat of chaos becomes brittle. Wisdom without the pressure of danger becomes complacent. Peace without the memory of war becomes naive. Ares ensured that memory never faded. He was the bruise beneath civilization, the reminder beneath every law. And so, while Athena built systems and Apollo shaped culture and Hera enforced bonds, Ares remained the test, the question mark, the force that asked again and again, what happens when everything else fails? In the end, Ares did not need temples filled with marble and gold. He lived in the moment a hand tightens around a weapon, in the breath held before a strike, in the decision that cannot be undone. And as long as mortals continue to face those moments, and they always will, the god of war remains exactly where he has always been, watching, waiting, ready. In the end, Ares did not fade the way softer gods sometimes did. He did not retreat into obscurity or become a name only scholars remembered. He remained, changed by centuries of stories, reshaped by poets, reinterpreted by those who feared him and those who needed him, but never erased. Because the god of war is not sustained by temples alone, he is sustained by moments. As ages turned and city-states rose and fell, mortals began to notice something strange. The world shifted, but Ares remained familiar. His armor might look different in new songs. His name might be spoken with less reverence and more caution. Yet the feeling he embodied, the surge before violence, the certainty that conflict was inevitable, never disappeared. Even when mortals began to compare him to other war gods, even when Rome reshaped him into Mars and softened his image into something more orderly, the older truth lingered underneath. The Roman god wore discipline and duty. Ares wore hunger. That hunger was older than empires. It was older than laws. And it did not require belief to exist. Ares learned over time that he did not need to stand openly among the Olympians to remain powerful. The gods themselves became more distant in mortal imagination. Temples cracked, oracles fell silent. Names were remembered but no longer feared in the same way. Yet war continued. And so did he. Ares adapted again, not in form, but in presence. He stopped appearing as a towering figure with a spear in his hand and began to exist as something more diffuse, more intimate, more dangerous. He became the pressure in a crowd when anger turns contagious. He became the thrill in a leader's voice when rhetoric sharpens into threat. He became the quiet conviction that violence is not only justified, but necessary. This was his final evolution. Not a god who needed worship, but a force that moved regardless of it. Even Zeus, king of the gods, could not command that kind of persistence, and Zeus knew it. There are late myths that suggest Zeus eventually understood his son better than he ever admitted aloud. That Ares, for all his flaws, served a purpose no other god could fill. Athena could teach strategy, but she could not ignite mass fury. Apollo could inspire order, but he could not unleash chaos. Hera could punish betrayal, but she could not start wars on her own. Only Ares could do that. Only Ares could take human emotion and push it past the point of restraint. That is why Zeus never truly cast him out, and that is why Ares never truly belonged. He existed in the margins of Olympus, tolerated rather than embraced, feared rather than praised. The gods did not invite him to celebrations unless they had to. They did not seek his counsel unless conflict was unavoidable. But when things broke, truly broke, they looked for him, and he always answered. Not with comfort, with escalation. Ares never claimed to be misunderstood. He did not seek redemption or justification. The myths never portray him asking forgiveness or longing for acceptance. That longing belonged to gods who wanted love. Ares wanted recognition, not applause, recognition of what he represented. He was the god who made it impossible to pretend that violence was rare or accidental. He was the reminder that beneath civilization's polish, there was always a breaking point. And when mortals crossed that point, Ares was already there, standing, waiting. Some poets imagined that in the distant future, war would end. That reason would prevail, that humanity would grow beyond the need for bloodshed. In those stories, Ares fades into silence, wandering battlefields that no longer exist. But those stories never lasted, because every generation learned the same truth in its own way. Conflict changes, but it does not vanish. It wears new armor, it speaks new languages, it finds new justifications, and Ares follows. Not as a conqueror riding at the head of armies, but as the force that makes armies possible in the first place. He lives in the decision to strike first, in the refusal to forgive, in the belief that strength must be proven through domination. These are not ancient ideas, they are current ones. And that is why Ares remains unsettling even now. Among all the gods of Greek myth, he is the one least safely contained in the past. You can admire Athena without becoming strategic. You can enjoy Aphrodite's stories without falling in love. You can read about Zeus without claiming power. But Ares? Ares is harder to keep at a distance, because his domain is not abstract. It is emotional, immediate, human. He is the god who asks no philosophical questions. He does not debate morality or destiny. He asks only one thing: will you fight? And once that question is answered, everything else follows. In the final telling, Ares does not stand triumphant or defeated. He stands unresolved. That is his truest form. Not a hero, not a villain, a force that reveals what happens when restraint fails. He does not promise glory. He does not promise justice. He promises intensity. And intensity always comes at a cost. So when ancient storytellers warned of Ares, they were not warning of a monster to be slain. They were warning of something closer, something internal. They were reminding listeners that war is not an accident, it is a choice. And Ares is what that choice looks like when it becomes unstoppable. He remains where he has always been. In the clenched jaw, in the raised voice, in the step forward that cannot be taken back. The god of war does not need the world to remember his name, he only needs it to keep fighting.